On September 15, 1944, a formation of American bombers streaked across the German sky, their engines roaring through clouds of flak and enemy fire. Below them, Nazi fighters circled like sharks, hunting for stragglers. The bomber crews were scared. They'd heard the stories. They knew what happened when German fighters found you alone, but then something happened that changed everything. Red-tailed P-51 Mustangs appeared on their wings. The pilots inside those fighters were the best escort pilots in the entire war. They never lost a single bomber to enemy fire on their watch, not one. But when those bomber crews landed and saw who had saved their lives, many refused to believe it, because the men climbing out of those red-tailed fighters were black. And in 1944 America, that wasn't supposed to be possible. This is the story of the black heroes of World War II, the soldiers, pilots, and tank crews who fought two wars at once, one against Nazi Germany and one against the country they were trying to save. This is the story America tried to hide, and it's time you knew the truth. When America entered World War II in December 1941, it was a segregated nation. Jim Crow laws ruled the South. Black Americans couldn't vote in most states. They couldn't eat at the same restaurants as white people. They couldn't drink from the same water fountains. They couldn't even sit in the same section of a bus. And when the call went out for soldiers to fight Hitler's racist regime, black Americans answered by the thousands. Over 1.2 million black men and women served in World War II. But they didn't serve alongside white soldiers. They served in segregated units, commanded mostly by white officers who didn't want them there. They were given the worst equipment, the least training, and the most dangerous jobs. And when they succeeded against all odds, their achievements were buried, minimized, or given to white units instead. The U.S. military wasn't just fighting a war overseas. It was fighting to keep black soldiers in their place. Let's start with the most famous story, the Tuskegee Airmen, but not the version you've seen in movies, the real story. The one that's even more remarkable, in 1941, the U.S. Army Air Corps didn't want black pilots. The prevailing belief among military brass was that black men lacked the intelligence, courage, and reflexes to fly combat aircraft. One Army War College study from 1925 concluded that black soldiers were cowards by nature. Another military report claimed black men had smaller skulls and therefore couldn't handle the complex thinking required for aerial combat. This wasn't fringe thinking. This was official military doctrine. But pressure was building. Civil rights organizations like the NAACP and black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier demanded that black men be allowed to fly. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt supported the cause. So in 1941, the Army created an experiment. They would train black pilots at a segregated facility in Tuskegee, Alabama. But it was designed to fail. The standards were impossibly high. The training was deliberately harder than what white pilots received. The washout rate was brutal. The Army wanted to prove that black men couldn't fly, so they set up a system to guarantee it. But something unexpected happened. The men succeeded. The first class of Tuskegee cadets included college graduates, teachers, and men who had saved for years to take flying lessons on their own. They were more educated on average than white pilot candidates, and they were determined to prove everyone wrong. Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the son of the Army's first black general, was one of the first graduates. He had endured 4 years of complete silence at West Point, where white cadets refused to speak to him outside of official duties. Now he was leading a squadron of black pilots into combat, and they were about to make history. The Tuskegee Airmen arrived in North Africa in 1943, flying P-40 Warhawks. They were assigned to escort duty, protecting bombers on their runs over Europe. It was the most dangerous job in the Air Corps. German fighters targeted bombers relentlessly, and escort pilots had to stay with the formation no matter what, even when enemy fighters tried to lure them away. Most escort groups had terrible records. Bombers were shot down regularly. But the Tuskegee Airmen, flying their distinctive red-tailed P-51 Mustangs, became legendary. Bomber crews started requesting them specifically. They called them the Red Tails. And they had a record that no other fighter group in the war could match. Of the over 200 escort missions they flew, they never lost a single bomber to enemy fighters. Not one. Think about that. In a war where bomber losses were catastrophic, where entire formations were wiped out by German fighters, the Tuskegee Airmen maintained a perfect record. They shot down over 100 German aircraft. They destroyed over 150 enemy planes on the ground. They sank a German destroyer with machine gun fire alone, a feat considered nearly impossible. 66 Tuskegee Airmen were killed in action. 32 were shot down and captured as POWs, and when the war ended, they came home to a country that still wouldn't let them vote. They landed at airfields where they couldn't use the same bathrooms as white pilots. They had saved countless American lives, destroyed the myth of black inferiority, and helped win the war. And America thanked them by maintaining segregation for another 20 years. But the Tuskegee Airmen weren't the only black heroes of World War II. Let me tell you about the 701st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, the tank unit that General George Patton said he was honored to have serving under him. In November 1944, as Patton's Third Army drove deep into Germany, he needed reinforcements. His tank battalions had been fighting nonstop since D-Day, and losses were mounting. The Army sent him the 701st Tank Battalion, an all-black unit that had been training in the United States for over 2 years. They'd been ready for combat for months, but the Army kept delaying their deployment. The reason was obvious. The military brass didn't believe black soldiers could handle tanks. Armored warfare required split-second decisions, mechanical knowledge, coordination, and courage under fire. The same old racist assumption said black men couldn't do it. When the 761st arrived, Patton gathered them together, and he gave a speech that shocked everyone. He said, "Men, you are the first Negro tankers ever to fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my Army. I don't care what color you are as long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches. Everyone has their eyes on you and is expecting great things from you. Most of all, your race is looking forward to you. Don't let them down, and damn you, don't let me down." It was vintage Patton, blunt, profane, and honest. And the 701st took it to heart. They were about to become one of the most effective tank battalions in the entire European theater. The 761st fought for 183 consecutive days. They spearheaded attacks into Germany. They liberated French towns. They broke through the Siegfried Line, Hitler's supposedly impenetrable defensive wall. They fought in the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest battle American forces faced in the war. When German forces launched their surprise winter offensive in December 1944, it was chaos. American lines collapsed. Entire divisions were surrounded, and the 701st, along with other tank units, held the line. They fought in sub-zero temperatures with inadequate winter gear. They slept in their tanks to avoid freezing to death. They ran out of ammunition and resupplied under fire, and they never broke. One member of the 761st was a young lieutenant named Jack Roosevelt Robinson. You might know him better as Jackie Robinson, the man who would break baseball's color barrier 3 years later. Robinson was court-martialed during the war for refusing to move to the back of a military bus in Texas. He was acquitted, but it showed the absurdity of the situation. Black soldiers were expected to fight and die for America, but they weren't allowed to sit wherever they wanted on a bus. The 761st's record speaks for itself. They were credited with killing or capturing over 6,000 enemy soldiers. They destroyed hundreds of German tanks, vehicles, and fortifications. They liberated over 30 towns. They fought alongside Patton's best units and earned their respect. But when the war ended, they were sent home without recognition. The Army quietly disbanded the unit. No victory parades, no medals, no acknowledgement. It would take until 1978, more than 30 years later, before the 761st Tank Battalion received the Presidential Unit Citation they had earned. And it would take until 1997 before one of their soldiers, Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, posthumously received the Medal of Honor he deserved. Rivers had been killed in action in November 1944. He'd refused evacuation despite being severely wounded, staying in his tank to cover his unit's advance. He died fighting, and the Army gave the credit to someone else. This pattern repeated throughout the war. Black soldiers performed acts of extraordinary courage, and white soldiers received the medals. Of the 464 Medals of Honor awarded during World War II, only one went to a black soldier. One. And that award wasn't made until 1997, after a comprehensive review found that dozens of black soldiers had been denied the nation's highest honor because of racism. Let's talk about what life was like for black soldiers during World War II, because it wasn't just about combat. It was about the daily humiliation of serving a country that treated you as less than human. Black soldiers trained at segregated bases, mostly in the South. They were housed in inferior barracks. They ate in separate mess halls. They used separate bathrooms and showers. When they went into nearby towns on leave, they faced Jim Crow laws. They couldn't go to movies. They couldn't eat in restaurants. They were expected to step off the sidewalk when white people walked by. And God help them if they looked at a white woman. In 1941, at Fort Benning, Georgia, a black soldier was lynched for supposedly insulting a white bus driver. No one was ever charged. In Alexandria, Louisiana, 29 black soldiers were arrested for refusing to leave a segregated recreation area that was supposed to be for white soldiers only. Some were beaten by military police. At Camp Van Dorn in Mississippi, white military police shot and killed a black soldier who was walking back to base. When other black soldiers protested, the camp went into lockdown. Rifles were issued to white soldiers to maintain order. The message was clear. Black soldiers were expendable. Meanwhile, German POWs held in camps across America were treated better than black American soldiers. German prisoners could eat in restaurants that wouldn't serve black soldiers. They could sit anywhere they wanted on buses. They were given good jobs and decent treatment. Black soldiers in uniform watched German prisoners of war receive better treatment than they did. Think about that. The enemy was treated with more respect than American citizens serving their country. Some of the worst treatment came from white officers who didn't want to command black troops. They saw it as a career killer, a punishment. They undermined their own soldiers at every turn. During training exercises, some white officers deliberately gave bad orders or set their units up to fail, then used the results as proof that black soldiers were incompetent. Other officers refused to recommend black soldiers for promotions or medals, no matter what they did. The few black officers in the military faced even worse treatment. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who commanded WWII Tuskegee Airmen, had a white subordinate refuse to salute him. The subordinate faced no punishment. Black officers weren't allowed in officers' clubs at many bases. They couldn't eat with white officers. Some white officers refused to serve under black commanders and successfully had themselves transferred. But despite all of this, black soldiers kept fighting. They kept proving themselves. And slowly, grudgingly, things began to change. One of the most important moments came in December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge. The German offensive had created a manpower crisis. American forces were stretched to the breaking point, and General Dwight D. Eisenhower needed reinforcements desperately. He made an unprecedented decision. He put out a call for black soldiers to volunteer for combat duty in integrated units. Thousands volunteered. They were tired of being relegated to support roles. They wanted to fight, but the Army couldn't quite bring itself to fully integrate, so they created a compromise. Black soldiers would fight alongside white soldiers, but in segregated platoons within the same companies. It was a half measure, but it was a start. Those black platoons performed brilliantly. They fought in some of the coldest, bloodiest combat of the war, and white soldiers who had never served alongside black troops saw them in action. They saw their courage, their skill, their determination. Surveys taken after the battle showed that white soldiers who fought alongside black troops had dramatically different attitudes about integration. The ones who actually served with black soldiers overwhelmingly supported integration. The racism didn't disappear overnight, but it cracked, and that crack would eventually break open the entire segregated military system. The war also changed how black soldiers saw themselves. They had fought the most racist regime in human history. They had defeated the Nazis. They had proven that the myths about black inferiority were lies, and they weren't going to come home and accept segregation quietly. When they returned to the United States, many became leaders in the civil rights movement. They weren't going to sit in the back of the bus anymore. They had fought for democracy abroad. Now they were going to fight for it at home. Medgar Evers, who had become a legendary civil rights leader before being assassinated in 1963, served in the 600 MF, the 7th Port Company in Europe. He fought at Normandy. He came home to Mississippi and had to fight for the right to vote. Jackie Robinson, after his time with the 761st Tank Battalion, broke baseball's color barrier and became one of the most important figures in American civil rights history. Hosea Williams, who would march alongside Martin Luther King Jr., was a decorated World War II veteran who nearly died from his injuries in combat. The generation of black veterans from World War II refused to accept the status quo. They had seen a glimpse of what equality could look like, even in the brutal context of war. They had served alongside white soldiers who treated them as equals. They had proven their worth in the most definitive way possible, and they were going to use that experience to change America. But change came slowly, too slowly. In 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the military. But actual integration took years. Some units remained segregated into the 1950s. Resistance from senior officers was fierce. Old attitudes die hard. And even after integration, black soldiers faced discrimination in assignments, promotions, and treatment. The contribution of black soldiers to World War II was systematically minimized for decades. History books barely mentioned them. Movies about the war were almost entirely white. When the Tuskegee Airmen were portrayed in media, it was often in simplified, sanitized ways that downplayed both their achievements and the racism they faced. The 761st Tank Battalion was nearly forgotten entirely. Other units, like the 92nd Infantry Division, which fought in Italy, or the 93rd Infantry Division, which fought in the Pacific, were ignored or dismissed as ineffective, even though they fought under impossible conditions with inadequate support. The famous Red Ball Express, the truck convoy system that kept Patton's army supplied during the race across France, was predominantly black. Over 75% of the drivers were black soldiers who drove night and day without headlights, under constant threat of German attack, to deliver food, fuel, and ammunition to the front lines. Without them, Patton's advance would have ground to a halt. But they received almost no recognition. Black engineers built bridges, roads, and airfields across Europe and the Pacific. Black medics saved lives under fire. Black quartermasters kept armies fed and equipped. They did the essential work that made victory possible, and they were treated as invisible. When D-Day is remembered, the beach landings get all the attention, but black soldiers were there too. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, an all-black unit, landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day. They operated the barrage balloons that protected the beachhead from German aircraft. They came ashore under the same fire as everyone else. They suffered casualties, but you almost never hear about them. When the liberation of concentration camps is discussed, it's rarely mentioned that black soldiers were among the liberators. Units like the 761st Tank Battalion and others were among the first American forces to see the horrors of the Holocaust firsthand. They saw what true evil looked like, and it reinforced why they were fighting. One of the most powerful stories comes from a Tuskegee Airman named Alexander Jefferson. He was shot down over France and spent 9 months as a POW in Stalag Luft III, the same camp made famous by the movie The Great Escape. When he was liberated and returned home to Michigan, he went to a restaurant with other veterans. He was refused service because he was black, he had been shot down fighting for America, he had survived a German POW camp, and he couldn't eat lunch in his own country. That was the reality black veterans faced, but their sacrifice wasn't in vain. The seeds they planted grew into the civil rights movement. The courage they showed in combat inspired a generation to fight for justice at home. The myths they destroyed about black inferiority helped pave the way for integration, and slowly, painfully, America began to change. In 2007, President George W. Bush finally awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the Tuskegee Airmen. Some of the original pilots were still alive to receive it. They were in their 80s and 90s. They had waited over 60 years for their country to say thank you. When President Barack Obama took office in 2009, he invited Tuskegee Airmen to the inauguration. He said he wouldn't have been standing there without them, and he was right. Their fight for equality helped make his presidency possible. Today, the story of black soldiers in World War II is finally being told more fully. But there's still so much that most people don't know. They don't know about the Port Chicago disaster where 320 sailors, 202 of them black, were killed in a massive explosion while loading ammunition. They don't know about the mutiny trial that followed, when 50 black sailors refused to return to work under unsafe conditions and were court-martialed. They don't know about Dory Miller, the Navy messman who shot down enemy planes during the Pearl Harbor attack despite having no combat training because black sailors weren't allowed in combat roles. He was awarded the Navy Cross, but he was sent back to serving food. He was killed in action 2 years later. They don't know about the 505th 5th Parachute Infantry Battalion, the Triple Nickels, the first all-black airborne unit. They trained as paratroopers but were never sent to combat. Instead, they were used to fight forest fires in the Pacific Northwest. They were trained to jump behind enemy lines, and they ended up fighting wildfires. The more you learn about black soldiers in World War II, the more you realize how thoroughly their story was suppressed. It wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate effort to maintain the fiction of white supremacy. If black soldiers were heroes, if they were as brave and capable as anyone else, then segregation couldn't be justified. So their stories were buried, their medals were denied, their achievements were given to others, and for decades, most Americans had no idea what really happened. But the truth has a way of coming out. The veterans told their stories to their families. Historians dug through records. Activists pushed for recognition. And slowly, the real history of World War II emerged, a history where black Americans fought on two fronts, where they faced racism from their own military while fighting the most racist enemy imaginable, where they succeeded against all odds and helped win the war, only to come home to a country that still treated them as second-class citizens. This is the story that should be taught in every school. This is the history that everyone should know. Because it's not just about the past. It's about understanding how we got here, how change happens, how courage looks. The black heroes of World War II didn't just fight for military victory. They fought for the idea that America could be better than it was, that the promises of freedom and equality could actually mean something. They didn't live to see all the change they fought for. Some of them died in combat. Others came home and spent decades fighting for civil rights. But they never gave up. They never stopped believing that America could live up to its ideals. And they were right. Not because change was easy or inevitable, but because people like them refused to accept injustice. They served with honor in a military that dishonored them. They fought for a country that denied them basic rights. And they won. Not just the war overseas, but the longer war for equality at home. So the next time you hear about World War II, remember the whole story. Remember the Tuskegee Airmen and their perfect escort record. Remember the 791st Tank Battalion and their 183 days of continuous combat. Remember the Red Ball Express drivers who kept armies supplied. Remember the engineers, the medics, the sailors, the Marines, all the black Americans who served. Remember that they fought two enemies, and remember that they won. This is their story, the story America tried to hide. But it's time everyone knew the truth. These are the black heroes of World War II. You can click in these other videos if you like this one. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel for more history documentaries.